Almost 10 years ago now, I was starting at a new church in Rockport, Indiana, and the church had a welcome dinner for myself and my family. And at that dinner, they had a quiz game where people tried to guess various facts about Kyla and the girls and I. And one of the questions that they asked is they asked the people to guess my favorite scripture. There we go. Now, I don't know how much you know about the Bible, but there are 1,189 chapters in it, over 31,000 verses, and hundreds of stories. What do you think the odds are of trying to guess someone's favorite scripture? Not quite up there with winning the lottery, but still pretty difficult. Now, naturally, none of them could guess, and I'm not sure that I ever told them. I told all of you my guiding scripture back at my induction service, Micah 6:8. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This is the scripture that I try to follow in my daily life. But my favorite scripture story, as Robin said, is actually here in Jeremiah 32, tucked away in this mostly somber book. This book takes place at the end of Israel's history as a sovereign nation, a country that's on the brink of war, a capital city on the brink of destruction. Babylon, this great empire to the north, the nation that had long threatened Israel's security, it was about to wipe this tiny nation off of the map. And for months, the city had been under siege. Food, water, the basic necessities of life were beginning to become scarce. The people were frightened, and rightfully so. The greatest empire that the world had known to that point was about to invade their city. Odds are that they would all be dead within the next few months. Those lucky enough to survive knew that, as was the Babylonian way, they would be carried off into captivity and made slaves in the land of Babylon. The hero of our story this morning, the prophet Jeremiah, was a political prisoner. He had made the mistake of telling King Zedekiah, the king of Israel, that this invasion was his own fault. That God was punishing Zedekiah and the people of Israel for their constant turning away from what God wanted them to be. Now, like any leader, Zedekiah didn't like to hear criticism about himself. And so he charged Jeremiah with treason, took him as a prisoner, albeit a very important and privileged prisoner. Jeremiah was given a little bit of free range of the courtyard where he was imprisoned. Zedekiah was afraid to throw him in a cell, whereas he would the normal prisoners, because after all, though he was mad at Jeremiah, Jeremiah was a prophet. He was God's chosen. And he didn't want to take the risk of mistreating someone that so obviously had God's favor, especially when Zedekiah so obviously didn't have God's favor. But anyway, while Jeremiah was being held captive, he received a vision from God. And in this vision, his cousin comes to him and asks him to buy a piece of family land in Anathoth. Now, what the story here doesn't make clear, but as we see, if we are reading the rest of Jeremiah, and as the original hearers would have, we'd have a knowledge of the land around it. By this time, Anathoth was already well behind enemy lines. It was well within Babylonian control. But when his cousin came to him, just as the vision foretold, Jeremiah believed that buying this land was exactly what God wanted him to do. Jeremiah bought this land for one simple reason: as a symbol. And symbols were something that Jeremiah was very, very good at. And he shows this again and again throughout the book that is named after him. At one point, he had been instructed by God to buy a belt made of soft linen and wear it everywhere until it literally fell apart, as a sign to the people of Israel that ruin was coming upon them. He was told to buy a clay jar and to smash it before the priests, warning them about how Jerusalem would soon become smashed beyond repair. He even went out and got a yoke like you would put on an ox and wore it around his neck everywhere he went to symbolize the yoke that Babylon would soon be putting upon the people. And so in this vein of giving symbols, this sale takes place and it's documented. Now again, the city is about to be overrun. Jeremiah was in prison. More people would soon be taken off into exile. This deed was already worthless at this point, because the land that Jeremiah bought was already in Babylonian hands. So let's go back to what I said at the beginning, that this is my favorite scripture. Note this time I put the question mark on the end up there. Why could this possibly be anyone's favorite scripture? What in this rather depressing story could possibly be uplifting or noteworthy? But you see, while many people were yielding to despair, Jeremiah bought that land as a sign of hope. Hope that God could be trusted to bring Judah into a renewed future. Envisioning a time when people would again buy houses and fields and vineyards, a sign that the land would be inhabited and prospering again. A time when all of these things that were just a part of everyday life were going to be restored. I don't think I'm telling you any big secret when I tell you that the church universal is not in a great place right now. I won't go into the reasons why. Opinions differ greatly as to the cause. But I think one thing that most people agree on is that the church has not always done a good job of being the church that God has called it to be. Now, we may disagree on why that is. We may disagree on why we're unable to reach people as God has called us to do. But I think most people can admit that the church, all churches, have failed in many ways in recent years. So this scripture, this story of Jeremiah buying this land that at the moment was worthless, but that he knew again would have value, this gives me hope for the church. Knowing that even though things may be bad now, just as for the people of Israel it was as bad as could get, that God has promised them and God has promised us that someday things will be better. We can even apply this to our lives outside the church. I know I've talked about before how the last few years we've all felt weighed down with disappointment and despair. Maybe now, again, as inflation continues to rise, maybe some of us are feeling the burden of bills yet unpaid. Maybe some of us are still lonely due to the passing of a loved one that we lost during COVID. Maybe we're living in fear and uncertainty as the biggest war in 100 years has broken out in Europe. When I was back in high school, there was a movie released called As Good as It Gets, starring Jack Nicholson. Does anybody remember this film? Jack Nicholson plays an author that has a great many OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and beyond that, he's really just a very cranky, unpleasant guy. But in the course of this movie, he's trying to change. And he meets this woman and he falls in love and he wants to change himself for her. And so he goes to his therapist unannounced, without an appointment, barges in past all the other people in the waiting room, someone who's about to go in the door, and he demands to be seen right now. And the therapist, having proper boundary, tells him, no, we can't do this right now. He argues back and forth, and finally Jack Nicholson leaves, and he's walking out and he's standing in the office in this waiting room full of all these people that are sitting there looking a bit nervous with their own problems and their own worries. And in his anger and in his despair, he stops, he sighs, and he says, "What if this is as good as it gets?" And he walks out of the room. And the camera pans to these patients, and you can almost see them wilt as this thought hits them. What if this is as good as it gets? Thankfully, the good news for us as Christians, we have the hope, we have the assurance, we have the promise that this is not as good as it gets. It was during a time of terrible fear and despair that Jeremiah listened to the voice of God, followed his instructions, even when those instructions would seem outlandish to any conventional human wisdom. And yet Jeremiah purchased the land. He made the investment. And then he sealed these deeds of purchase in a clay jar so that they would last a long time. For this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says: houses, fields, and vineyards will again be bought in this land. No matter what is happening in our lives at right this moment, are we willing to believe? Are we willing to proclaim, along with Jeremiah, these promises of God? To claim it for ourselves? To invest in a future despite what we sometimes see as the absence of hope? Jeremiah was a person who trusted in God against all the odds. He refused to give in to despair. Instead, he trusted in God's goodness. He allowed God to be in control of his actions. He adopted a lifestyle of hope. Are we willing to trust God when he tells us the plans that he has for us? Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, there's one thing that I really want to point out here about Jeremiah's gesture. His gesture was a symbol of hope. But note that it's not necessarily the hope that the people were expecting or even wanting at the time. His symbol didn't tell them that the siege was going to fall. He didn't tell them that the Babylonians were going to be miraculously defeated. He didn't even tell them that things were going to be okay. What he told them was that there would be hope. But it was going to be on the other side. Hope on the other side of despair. Hope on the other side of destruction. Hope on the other side of whatever it is we are facing in our lives right now. The past week, I have been immersing myself in some of the great histories of Godalming United Church. This one was written at the 100-year centenary of the Congregational Church in 1968. This one was written in 1978 by Peter Andrews. This one is a section of the anniversary celebration of the centennial of the Methodist Church in 2003. And as I read all of these things, as they talked about the histories of both of the churches that have come together, one thing I noticed is throughout this history, there were ups and there were downs. And although we are at a dark place perhaps in the church right now, this is not the first time that this has happened. Within these histories, I'm reading stories of the church sending its young men off to war, not once but twice, not knowing whether any of them will come back. I'm reading of times when it looks as if that there is no hope for what the church's future is going to be. As a matter of fact, as I read it, it struck me that even the creation of this church, the United Church, would have been a bit of a time of mourning for the Congregationals that were leaving their building across the road. And yet God has worked through all of these times, all of these circumstances, and He has revived and renewed the church again. And I have no doubt that He can do that with our church today. With Godalming United Church, with the church here in England, with the church in Great Britain and America and around the world, I have no doubt that God still has plans for us. That God still is calling us to be the people, the church that He wants us to be, making disciples of Jesus Christ, and in doing so, transforming the entire world.